The year is 1962. The Cold War has turned the world into a volatile battlefield of tension, fear, and distrust. Two nuclear-armed superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stand locked in a deadly standoff. For 13 days in October, the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed humanity closer to extinction than ever before. But what if it hadn't ended peacefully? What if a single miscalculation or act of aggression triggered an unstoppable chain reaction? What if the Cuban Missile Crisis became the spark that ignited World War III? This isn't just a chilling what-if scenario. It's a terrifying glimpse into an alternate history where diplomacy failed and nuclear devastation became reality. Prepare to journey through this nightmarish timeline as we uncover how quickly the unthinkable could have unfolded, plunging the world into darkness. The real crisis. The roots of the Cuban Missile Crisis trace back to the end of World War II. As the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as rival superpowers, their ideological conflict, capitalism versus communism, fueled tensions worldwide. The nuclear arms race accelerated these hostilities, with each side amassing weapons capable of destroying the other many times over. By the late 1950s, the stakes grew even higher. In 1959, Fidel Castro's communist revolution in Cuba brought the Cold War to America's doorstep. The failed U.S.-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 solidified Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union as Castro sought protection from further American interference. Khrushchev's bold decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba had two clear objectives: to shield Cuba from American aggression, to counter the threat posed by U.S. missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, which could strike Soviet cities in minutes. By October 1962, Soviet ships carrying missile components were nearing Cuban shores. American reconnaissance flights uncovered evidence of missile installations, setting off alarm bells in Washington. On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy convened his closest advisors, faced with a monumental decision: a tense standoff. The 13 days. Kennedy chose a middle ground strategy: a naval blockade or quarantine to prevent further Soviet shipments to Cuba. But this move came with its risks. Both sides exchanged ultimatums, and tensions mounted as Soviet ships approached the blockade line. Communication between Moscow and Washington was sparse, leaving both nations grappling with incomplete information. Behind the scenes, the world's military forces were on high alert. Soviet missile crews in Cuba prepared for possible U.S. airstrikes, while the American Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness short of full-scale nuclear war. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary citizens in the U.S. and the USSR lived in fear, unsure if their next sunrise would be their last. History tells us diplomacy prevailed, but in this alternate timeline, Black Saturday, October 27, 1962, took a catastrophic turn. October 27, 1962. The turning point. Black Saturday was the most dangerous day of the crisis, even in reality. Several near-disastrous events occurred. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, Jr. His death brought intense pressure on Kennedy to respond militarily. Another U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska, prompting Soviet fighter jets to scramble. A Soviet submarine carrying nuclear torpedoes was cornered by U.S. Navy depth charges, with its crew under the impression that war had already begun. In this alternate scenario, one fateful event tips the balance. The Soviet submarine, unable to communicate with Moscow, interprets the depth charges as an attack. Its captain orders the launch of a nuclear torpedo, which strikes the USS Randolph, a U.S. aircraft carrier enforcing the blockade. Thousands of American sailors perish in the fiery explosion, marking the first nuclear strike in history. Escalation. The first nuclear strike's news of the attack reaches Washington, where stunned officials demand retaliation. President Kennedy, weighing his options, authorizes massive airstrikes on Cuba to destroy the missile installations. Within hours, U.S. bombers unleash devastation across Cuba, leveling missile sites but failing to eliminate all threats. Soviet commanders in Cuba respond by launching 3 nuclear missiles toward the United States. Miami and Tampa are obliterated, their populations vaporized in seconds. A third missile aimed at Washington, D.C. is intercepted, but radioactive fallout spreads across the eastern seaboard, creating chaos and panic. The war goes global. As American missiles strike Soviet cities, including Moscow and Leningrad, the conflict spirals into a global nuclear war. NATO forces in Europe mobilize, and the Soviet Union targets key Western cities. London, Paris, and Berlin are wiped out, while NATO's retaliation destroys Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest. The conflict draws in other nations. China, seizing the opportunity, invades Soviet territories in Asia, prompting further nuclear exchanges. India and Pakistan, already on the brink of war, escalate their conflict into a catastrophic nuclear exchange, further destabilizing the region. This isn't just a war between nations, it's the end of civilization as we know it. Nuclear winter, the fallout of Armageddon. The widespread detonation of thousands of nuclear warheads releases vast amounts of soot and ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight. Global temperatures plummet, triggering a nuclear winter. Crops fail worldwide, leading to mass starvation. Radiation sickness sweeps across continents, claiming millions more lives. Entire ecosystems collapse. Survivors face a bleak existence, struggling for food, water, and shelter in a shattered world devoid of functioning governments or infrastructure. Could it have been prevented? In our timeline, the Cuban Missile Crisis was diffused through diplomacy. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade and a secret deal to withdraw American missiles from Turkey. This fragile compromise underscored the importance of communication and restraint in preventing global catastrophe. The crisis also led to the creation of the Moscow-Washington hotline, allowing direct communication between the superpowers to avoid future misunderstandings. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a stark reminder of the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. As long as these weapons exist, so does the threat of their use, whether by accident, miscalculation, or intent. This alternate history isn't just a chilling story, it's a call to action. The choices we make today will determine whether humanity avoids a similar catastrophe. Could humanity survive a global nuclear war, or would it mark the end of civilization as we know it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this alternate history left you with chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more what-if scenarios.